the press, and they would come into the conference room to play the game. And they'd come in, oh, I know how to play. I've been playing video games forever. I'm so good. And they'd sit down, and we'd be like, okay, go out into this space. And a truck would come around the corner. All of a sudden, we'd be like, dead humans.
Yeah.
And right away, they were like, this is a different kind of game.
Absolutely. So after a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, we had to take a game that was supposed to be a demo and turn it into a full-fledged AAA title in just over a year, I think we did that.
Yeah, a year and a half.
Yeah.
We should comment on what AAA title means.
Right. Good point.
So a AAA title, in video games, I don't think there's a double A or a single A, but AAA means this is going to be a big game. It's going to be the highest level of quality. It's going to go out usually worldwide. It's going to be localized in a lot of languages. It's going to go onto all the different consoles. At the time, it was Xbox and PlayStation
and PC.
Mm-hmm. And so you're not just developing for one platform, but you're doing multiple simultaneously, trying to hit milestones and times.
Sure.
But AAA generally means as high quality as you can get for the project you're doing. And what that means, boots on the ground, for those of us on the team, is no sleep. So.
Sure. So once we finished up that project, we again started it from scratch. We had to develop all the technology, the look, the design, and make sure that design worked for the consumer audience and not just a niche market. And we pulled it off. It was very successful. There was actually a sequel to that title. So and that's how we became great friends and collaborators since that point. And from 2003, 2004, somewhere in there. Yeah, quite a while ago.
So Pandemic Studios at its peak had, I think, 5 projects of like 50 people each. So the studio is running 250 to 400, depending, plus contractors. It was a big studio in Los Angeles with a very creative team. And since then, most of the leads on those teams have gone on to do games like Halo, Destiny, some of the really Gears of War, some of the biggest
and
titles.
God of War,
and God of War, and not just junior people. We're talking about some of the creative directors of those projects, form their own companies. So it was a real passionate group of people who worked really, really hard. And I guess maybe the first thing we should say is that passion that you feel, that you love about video games, keep that alive, because it'll drive you through all the late nights and all the hard work and other things. And other people feed off that. Your colleagues and your friends will feed off that passion and love of games, and you never know where those people are going to end up.
Absolutely.
So the number one rule is always ship. If you're working on a project, if you're working on a homework assignment, if you're working on a game, finish it. And that's, I think, the most important thing.
Right. Well, just to add on to what John was saying, one thing you want to, there's an adage that someone told me once, and they said, done is better than perfect. And as creatives, artists, engineers, we always want to make something perfect. We always want to take that extra edge. We want to, hey, can we have a little more time to make this perfect? Can we have a little more time to make this? That's great. Keep that going, but pay attention to the deadlines, because a finished product that everyone can go and look at is better than the potential of an unfinished project that no one sees. So always, there's got to be a point, a little thing in yourself where you've got to say, okay, I've got to put it out there. And part of that's fear. Part of that's that creative drive. But you have to. There is a point where you have to say, okay, we're going to put this out. We're going to see what everyone else says, whether it's a friend, whether it's your instructors, whether it's a larger company, whether it's a corporation. You want to keep that in mind. And again, that's hard to do. I still have issues with that. With just saying, okay, we have to cut this off now and put it out there, because you're going to learn so much more putting it out there and showing everyone else and getting feedback, even if it's feedback that you don't necessarily enjoy, that's hard to hear. It's feedback. It's better when someone tells you that you need to move in another direction, or that how you can improve, than no one's saying anything at all. But you'll learn more from that than you ever will by just staying isolated and thinking, okay, if I just keep pushing at this by myself, it's going to get better. Oftentimes, it's best to show it and share it out with everyone.
I would add to that. I think artists get a reputation of, everything has to be perfect and, it has to be so way. But engineers are the same way. Engineers, it's got to be perfect. My code has to be optimal. It has to be everything. So everybody on the team, when you look around, realize everybody else feels that too. They want their stuff to be perfect, whether it's the artists, whether it's the designers, whether it's the engineers. On an engineering team, when you've got a group of people who need to work together, don't ask what's best. Ask, can you live with it? So when you're trying to get something out, what's best is it's very hard to know what is best. But if you ask, can you live with it, then other people are going to go, that'll work, and then you'll move on to the next big challenge, because there's going to be a challenge after that challenge. So that's kind of what we use in engineering, is can you live with it? So just moving along, there's a little bit of time. If it isn't clear, my background is engineering. I was a lead network programmer on Pandemic and on other games. I was then a lead graphics engineer, and then eventually a director. I ran video games and built teams and came up with projects, and still would like to do that as much as I can. You want to talk about your background a little bit?
Sure. My background is as an artist. I started drawing when I was, I think, 1.5, 2 years old, drawing a stegosaurus on the wall, and my parents realized that it wasn't just scribbles, it was actually a dinosaur after going to the museum. So from then on, I kept up with art and got into video games almost by mistake. I originally wanted to move into special effects after seeing the first Jurassic Park, and I said, that's what I want to do. And went through school at the time. Schools just weren't set up like this one. There were no schools that specialized in video games, video technology, animation, nothing like that. They were in their infancy, but most major universities, or traditional universities, I would say, didn't have programs like that at all. So I kind of had to find my way through that process, and I eventually did. And after I graduated, I came back from California. I went to school in Chicago. Came back to California and said, okay, got to find a movie job. And a buddy of mine said, hey, I work at this video game company. I'm thinking, really? You can work as okay. Do they pay money? Okay. Can I start today? Sure. What do I need to learn? Oh, all the stuff we've been working on. He was actually helping me with graphics programs and learning 3D, because he was even working in games as a contractor in college for a little bit. So I started that and loved it. I was there 24 hours a day. I slept there, ate there, still wasn't getting paid. And eventually they hired me on, and that's where my career started. Around the time that I met Jon is when I had my first venture into art direction. Since then, I've been working in various capacities of art and creative direction since then for various companies on all types of projects, from console to mobile to AR and VR and experimental technologies.
So Chris, I'm gonna brag for you. He worked on the secret team at Microsoft that did the HoloLens, which is all the virtual reality where it projects it into the space. And for years, he was up working in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. Actually, it was in Canada, it was in Victoria. Mm-hmm. And he couldn't tell me what he was working on because it was top secret. I think it was like 7 years ago now.
Yeah.
So they had the HoloLens, which now you guys are like, oh yeah, we got that.
Yeah, there's one in the back. Yeah.
So I actually am going to throw, that was one of the points I wanted to make that's important. The thing about video games and the interactive entertainment space is that it's always changing. Back when we started, it would change with the console cycles. You'd have the Xbox, or you'd have the PlayStation 2, and then the PlayStation 3, and the Xbox 360, and it was always changing. Meanwhile, Nintendo's doing something and making tons of money because they're geniuses. And then it's PC, and then it's mobile, and then it's AR and VR, and right now it's this virtual reality and AR, and you think, oh, that's it, we're done. It's going to change. So in this industry, the industry is always changing. It's always on the cusp. So I think that's part of the appeal, but you also have to stay on your feet. You have to learn your whole life. You're not going to come out of university and be like, cool, I got this. You're going to keep reading, keep learning. 10 years from now, you're still going to be learning new technologies and new techniques, and there's going to be new engines and other things. So keep that in mind, that the habits you're putting in place right now are going to serve you later in your job if you choose this career.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Jon mentioned the learning never stops. It's a double-edged sword, because the learning never stops and the learning never stops. So when you think, I'm going to handle on things, perfect, I can do what? There's a new technology, there's a new platform, there's something that you may be asked to do at a company, and you have to figure out an entirely new cycle, an entirely new production pathway, an entirely new way to schedule, an entirely new way to experiment, use a series of new technologies that you've never used before, and you have 6 months to figure out how to do that. And that's a double-edged sword, because it's fun and it's exciting, but it is very, very stressful. But it's not stressful in an annoying way, like, okay, I have to do this thing over and over and over again 70,000 times, where it's not challenging. But you may have to figure out 70,000 things to do one thing, which is very, very different than having something that's a process that's monotonous. So Always challenge yourself. If you're always challenging yourself and you're always learning about what's new, then when that change comes, when a new console or a new technology comes about, or another one you've been working on for a long time falls away, consoles don't stay for very long. Companies go out of business. There are plenty of examples of that where something was all the rave and then it's now gone. So you have to retrain yourself. You have to know that if you can, you get to a position, you may understand that's coming, but if it does come, and sometimes it'll hit you. There are plenty of companies where we've worked and done we've worked, 80-hour weeks, and the project is finished and the company's gone. You have to think about that and say, okay, I learned a huge amount here. How do I reinvent myself? How do I take the skills that I've learned and move into the next chapter? So if you're able to do that yourself, it'll be much easier to weather those storms and meet those challenges.
Yeah, I would add to that. So for my career, I've worked at a lot of great studios. I worked at Pandemic. That was my second studio. I did consulting for a company called Visual Concepts, which you probably don't know of, but you know their projects. They did NFL 2K, NBA 2K, NHL 2K, and they still do them to this day. They were bought by first Sega, which nobody realizes, and now they're owned by Take-Two Interactive, which is one of they do a little game called Grand Theft Auto and Red Dead Redemption. You might have heard of. And to this day, they're still going. I consulted with them, or I worked for them for a while on Fantastic Four video game for a movie. Working on movie video games is a double-edged sword as well. It's good and it's bad. Now, most people have figured out don't try and tie the movie to the game, but they will take the license and they'll treat it in a good way and do a good game. I worked for Electronic Arts. I consulted for a bunch of different companies, and then this is where things take a left-hand turn. I left video games for a while. And as an engineer, I went to Wall Street. They called me. So it turns out gaming and game development, the things you're learning to optimize, to design shaders, to do hardware, CUDA, graphics, networking, all of the networking, the high-speed hardware, these things are what Wall Street, what the finance industry is using every day to trade options and equities and stocks and things. And so they were calling video game guys because we could do it. So all the things you're learning now, you don't know what you're going to do with it. So learn everything you can and learn the concepts. Learn the concepts underneath it, not just the one game that you want to make, because you don't know what your life is going to do. It's hard to see that where you are right now. But like some of the basic classes, you might be like, oh, this is boring, I got this. Pay attention, because you don't know that you're going to be a video game guy 10 years from now or 20 years from now. So then I came back into video games because that's where my love is. And I was a director. I put together a team that did a music video game. And we worked with some famous rock stars and had a lot of fun and worked for 4 years on that project. I hired a team of about 80 people and contracted about half of it out to people who were remote, which is now how all development really happens. We'll talk about that maybe a little bit. And to put kind of an exclamation point on Chris's point, we shipped the game, multiple regions. It did well in Japan. And then a month later, the company was gone after we worked really hard for 4 years. And that's just part of it, because you work really, really hard on this thing and you don't know what the market's going to do. So you just put it out there and maybe the market works and maybe it doesn't. In this case, it was a business decision that had nothing to do with me. But, that was hard. So what do? You get up the next day and you find the next thing.
To echo with the 4 years, there was a project that I believe was mentioned beginning by KG. It was called Saboteur. And that project for Pandemic was developed by another internal team. They did a demo for it. It had legs. Everyone loved it. The owners were pitching it around. And the team I was working with was an R&D team. And they said, well, you can continue doing R&D. That's fine. But we'd really like for you guys to work on these other projects. So we ended up picking Saboteur. And we said, hey, we'll do this if we can do it our way, because the other team had established a different style and some different feature sets. We do it our way. We hire our own team and stuff like that. And that was a 4.5 year project, literally from a sheet of paper to say, okay, here's what the new pitch is going to be, to developing everything for that project. The team at its height was probably close to 200 people, and that includes localization. We worked with 5 different external developers for art and engineering, and to port the game from Xbox 360 to PS3. Myself, I had an art team of 42. on staff. That's concept, that's UI, that's animation, that's environment artist, and that's asset artist. And the game was massive. It was basically, if you think of taking World War II and putting it in, think of taking GTA and putting it in Paris, World War II, France. And that was the idea of the game. And one of the crazy things was when we were pitching the game around and showing people to try to get a publisher and stuff like that as we started to develop the IP, is people went, oh, at the time, people were going, oh, another World War II game. Great. What's so different about this? And that was a kick in the teeth, because we're going, what? Okay. We had to really go back, and that was that part of feedback. We had to say, okay, how do we differentiate this product and get people excited about it so they're not thinking of another World War II game, another soldier in Normandy, another soldier in Russia, another soldier in Italy, or something like that, where that genre for World War II, everyone thought of that. So we had to come up with a new way of pitching, not only pitching the product, but to differentiate the product, the hero, the character, the types of things you were going to be doing, because the main character was fighting against the Nazis, but he was a spy. So how do we leverage his persona as a spy and differentiate him from the normal soldier that's going to be in the 101st Division of Airborne for the U.S. or something else, or a British group. So we were able to do that successfully, but it took us a while to create it. We had to develop all the technology. We had to convince our owners that we needed to create a whole new engineering tool set for it. We had to create a whole new editor. We had to create a whole new engine that was different from the other game called Mercenaries, which was also being developed at the same time in the same studio, and also an open world game. So the owners are going, well, why do you have to create something new? Why don't you just use their technology? And that was a very hard sell, but we were able to do it and actually create a successful title. But we had to do everything from scratch. And one of the greatest things is, as we were doing research, we realized we're not getting this right. We had a lot of other team members who were from Europe, and they were saying, you know what, Chris, that doesn't look like Europe. I'm going, the art director, what do you? How dare you? But you know what? They were right. They were absolutely right. And one of the lead engineers bet me $50 that if we ever go to Europe and you're going to look around, you're going to see everything, because I know you're going to realize that the way I'm saying it, not because I'm better than you or you're not the art director, whatever, but it just looks different. I guarantee you that's going to happen. Thinking, okay, sure. And we go on a trip. We took a week research trip to Paris and the surrounding area. And at the top of a hill at Sacré-Cœur, I reached in my wallet without looking at the view and gave him $50 because I lost the bet. Because everything that he was saying was absolutely right. So that was a great learning experience for me to say, you know what? Even if you can't see it and someone else is telling you, pay attention to it, investigate it, look at it. Ask them why it is they think the way they do, or why they have that opinion. Even if they can't articulate it in the way that you may think they should, or that you may understand it, there's a kernel of information there that's very important. So, and that totally revolutionized how we were producing the game. And we were able to create a very successful title, to where even when we were doing press events in Paris, people there were saying, thank you. No one has ever recreated the city, recreated the culture in a game the way that your team has. So thank you. That meant a lot to me, to say, good, all that hard work paid off. So.
Well, I'll add to that. Chris is being modest because he won awards for that game. One of the main takeaways from the game, you may not know the game, but you may remember this, that all of Paris is black and white. It's like an old film from the 50s, and it's dark and it's scary in the places where Nazi Germany has taken it over. And you, as your role, you go throughout the city and you free different the neighborhoods of Paris. And as you do, they turn pastel and beautiful colors. So you could climb up the Eiffel Tower and look across Paris, and parts of it would be in black and white with thunderstorms and Nazis, and part of it would be like pastels and beauty, and that was all this guy. And they won awards for this. So
It wasn't just me, it was the team.
Very striking visual design. I'm going to talk briefly about something, it's a topic I like to talk about, which is personality in video games. In movies, everything's about narrative and about plot and about story and character development. And people who come into video games from film and writing often get confused. And they think video games are about story and narrative, and when they're trying to fix a game, because games are all broken. The games you play are finished. Mm-hmm. The games are broken while you're developing. They're totally broken. They're not fun. They're kind of miserable. A lot of things don't work. And the part that doesn't work isn't usually the tech or the art. It's the fun. And you'll have people who don't understand this. Oh, well, just turn the fun knob up. Well, you can't do that. It's a very difficult problem. It's because games are interactive. And so, I think a lot of people feel like they understand film, and they say, oh, you need a narrative arc, and you need plot, and the character has to have challenges. It's like, no. What about Tetris? Tetris is one of the greatest games ever made. Where's the character? Where's the narrative? But it's a great game. So you have this kind of problem of vocabulary, of language around video games, of what word do you do? And the word, I worked with a bunch of teams that we developed original titles. This was before we did some movie titles, we were developing internal titles. And the word we came up with, and I don't know if this translates, is personality. The personality of the game and the interactive nature of the game. But the personality of Tetris is a Russian puzzle game. It's got to be Russian. It's got to have that Kremlin picture in the background, and it feels kind of Russian and challenging. And you see that in like Super Mario Brothers. It's a personality. The gameplay is mostly jumping and running, which is great. That's great gameplay. But the personality, if you don't have the guy with the mustache and the mushrooms and everything else, that personality has a flavor to it. And as you go down the line, there's a famous game, God of War. Jaffe, the creative director of Jaffe, did a big article about this, and it's worth repeating. This is not my information, this is his. But he talked about, as they were developing that game, coming up with the kind of the go-to phrase at Electronic Arts at EA, they call it the X. But this is the touchstone that you can go to anytime you have a question when you're developing a game. And so with God of War, you have this character, Kratos, and you ask different people, like, oh, he's angry. Oh, he's mean. Oh, he's this. No, he's brutal. Brutality. And I don't know how that translates. Does that translate? Brutal. So, the way he looks, the way his weapons are, the way the enemies are, the way the UI is. When you go into the game, you don't just click buttons. Knives are in the UI. And there's a famous anecdote where he was working with one of the animators. And this is a great example of a good director, because the animator was animating somebody he was pulling a switch to open a door. So, okay, pull the switch, open door, walk through, right? And he said, no. And the feedback he gave the animators, he said, it has to be more brutal. And so now when you play that game, when you see God of War, when he pulls a switch to open a door, what does he do? He's like, gets his shield, he knocks it to the side, kicks the door open, and he's like, dude, you're walking through a door. But it's brutal. And the way he kills the enemies, and the way he walks, and the way his weapons work, and everything in that game has this brutality. And so when we were developing the rock and roll game, early on, we developed RX, which was raw, real rock. And this was useful because as we were developing the game, we could look at the choice of the songs, or the UI components, or the gameplay, or the feedback, and it was like, is it raw? It's just a knob. No. Is the knob raw, real rock? It's like, I could change that knob into an amplifier knob. There it is. And so we had this kind of touchstone that we could go through that everybody could use. The sound designers, the artists, the animators, the UI, the gameplay, everybody would have this kind of touchstone. So as you're thinking about your games, think about this touchstone phrase or X that describes the personality of the game. Because it's not about character. Character is very important. It's not about narrative. Narrative is important. It's about personality and staying true to that and being able to communicate it with your team. So that's something I like to talk about that I think has been helpful to me.
Okay. I have a slightly different experience with that. One thing that I've been doing for quite a few years now is I ask myself, where are games going? What new technologies are out there that are going to allow us to, change how you play games, how you view games, how you create them. And that led me to working on the product development for the HoloLens. And that was something that was an eye-opener. I had a headache for 6 months as we were trying to figure out all these new things, because what we realized is, you're no longer in front of a TV. You no longer have a joystick. You no longer have a set space for how and when and where you're going to play, because now you have something that basically acts like glasses and you're seeing everything in your room. So now that you have a table to worry about, now that you have a room full of people, now that you have speakers or a person next to you, and you're now the joystick and you have to initiate a particular action to move through the space, what does that look like? How does that feel? What kind of personality do you have, and that's going to allow you to play this experience? Because it's very different using your thumbs. We've done that for most of civilization, right? And we developed all of our tools based on that. However, now when you don't have a hammer, you don't have something, you have another repetitive motion. How do you now, use your fingers to close a menu or push away or pull it towards you, or use your head to navigate to see certain things around the environment? That's very, very different. It's a very different challenge than saying, okay, I have a box and I can move my thumb here and say click and I'm done. If you have to do that with something in the room, you have an experience where there are many of them, we would have clues that were posted around the room. So you have to look around the room and see a sign. So we had to think very differently from how most of us had created video games. We had to think of, how do you now look at a museum installation? What draws your eye around an exhibit? What guides you through a space? If I look around here, I see where there's an exit. I see signs for where there's an emergency fire extinguisher there. I know how to get downstairs. When you're designing a space, you have to think drastically differently when you're moving through a physical space with digital elements in it, as opposed to having a fictional world that you're looking in through a window, which is your television. So you have to really, I hate saying the word paradigm shift, but it's a process, it's a mental process shift where you have to think about something in a different way. You're still using all the same elements. You still use icons. Your icons are going to be the same. What icon in a video game that you look at to grab your attention is ironically the same thing that you would use in this room. If there's a dark room, I'm going to use a brighter color to, grab the user's attention. But I also have to think about whether the user wears glasses, how tall they are, how short they are. What else are they paying attention to in the room? What other real things are happening in a physical space that may draw their attention away from what I'd like for them to look at? So it's a very different thought process. But the thing that I've learned and what I enjoy and what keeps me moving is we've done all the same things in games. We've just done the same things in a different space. We've done them inside of the console. We've done them inside of the television screen. Now we're pulling that out and saying, how do we use those same skills and apply them to the real world? And all the skills will translate. And that's something that we started in one thing 20 years ago or whatnot, but you're living in that space now. It's going to be a part of your reality probably next year. It's just the products are coming out. You're going to have opportunities to work on that, and it's becoming the mainstay. So you may not have to figure out that moment because you're going to live it. But there's going to be something else when we're long gone and we're retired that we can't even imagine that you're going to have to take up the baton and go, I plug this into my head and I can see what, like the Matrix or something. So thank you, Elon Musk.
How are we on time? 15 minutes more. Okay. This is echoing. Actually, I think.
I was going to say, we have 15 minutes left. I don't want to cut off your point. No. But I'm sure you're curious. Did you have any questions for us?
Yeah.
I know we've talked a lot about our experience and things like that, but we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah. I would second that.
How much potential do you see in the video game?
I think a lot.
Huge.
Huge.
With what countries have you worked? But
sure. So the question, I'll repeat the question. The question is, how much potential do you see in video games in Mexico? And I think there's a huge amount of potential here for a bunch of very good reasons. And to answer the other question, which is where else have we worked? I'll let you come on to that because you have a lot more experience. But so I worked on a team that we outsourced all of our work to Hyderabad, India. And I can tell you, sending somebody to Hyderabad, India, to make sure that the studio is actually there before we start sending our stuff over there was real interesting. We lost 2 guys for about 2 weeks. And then, on another game that I did, I contracted out to Montreal in Canada, and we had people also in Austin, Texas, and in Boston, Massachusetts, as well as another team locally. So different outsourcing. And most of the outsourcing nowadays is, there's a lot of it in Asia. in Tianjin and in Shenzhen and Taiwan. And you actually, I'm going to stop. You talk about this. Okay.
So that's something that all of us in the games industry recognize for quite a while, that external development used to be kind of we'll do that in case of emergency. In case if my project is in trouble, break open external development glass, right? But it's now commonplace. People build that into their production. They know they're going to have to do that because there once was a time where you had a huge team, but no one wants to do that anymore. Studios want to scale down. They want to economize. That's a lot of money to invest in a studio that large. You have to bring in all those people. You have to spend the time to pull them in, get equipment, training, so on and so forth. And then once your product is done, where do they go, right? So many studios in the US and Europe and Canada are scaling down and keeping a core team. And then they're saying, hey, we'd like to have an external team somewhere else, whether they're in the United States, whether they're in Canada, wherever, either experts in their field that may not work in the studio or external studios all over the world. I had the opportunity to work with an external developer as their studio art director after working with them as our external partner for several years. And there was a project I was working on when I was living in British Columbia where we had an emergency, we needed assets, we didn't have a large team, so they helped us build out a lot of our characters, some of our environment stuff, spaceships, things like that. And afterwards they asked me, they said, hey, we'd like for you to work with us. So I said, sure. However, I worked out of Los Angeles for a company that was based out of Taiwan, and they had studios in Beijing, Suzhou, which is about 2 hours east of Shanghai, and in Taiwan. So I worked with the team every day. I worked their hours, so they're several hours ahead of us. So I worked from 6 p.m. to about 2 a.m. in the morning, so I could work one-on-one with the team. And I traveled to Asia about 2 to 4 times a year, depending on the need. And of course, the team came here, so that was very successful. But most larger teams that own IPs or whatnot, they are always looking for external teams all over the world, not just China, Japan, Korea, Dubai, Morocco. Southeast Asia is another place that's growing quite a bit. I've met a lot of studios in Mexico and in Brazil, Peru, Russia, obviously. Ukraine is a big hub, so there are studios all over the planet, in almost every country that are doing that same kind of work, and they're working with developers all around the world. So it's ubiquitous. It's a part of life. So absolutely, there are opportunities. It's just finding them and capitalizing on them.
So I would add to that. I think there are concrete reasons why Mexico has a huge opportunity. One, all of you pretty much speak English, which is amazing because you also speak Spanish, but that's not amazing for you. But the bilingual part for big development teams and people who are centered in the U.S. And Chris and I are from the U.S., so we're U.S. centric. But that's also, let's not kid ourselves. That's where a lot of the money is that drives this. So at the end of the day, right now, Los Angeles, because of the entertainment industry, and San Francisco, because there's all the technology there, drives a lot of what's coming out. Also, Seattle, because of Microsoft, drives a lot of the video games that you see in the U.S. But like we were talking about this earlier, that Netflix is going out and getting all this wonderful television and movie IP in other countries for those countries. So eventually it'll come back around that it won't be the U.S. pushing their games to Europe and to Mexico and other places. It'll be the other way around. Mexico will develop its own games. And the first studio that we worked at, Pandemic Studios, didn't start as an original IP. We did contract stuff. It was for the U.S. Army. We were doing anything we could get our hands on. So I know, talking to people, some of you guys are studying, and maybe you're doing visualizations for medical stuff. Maybe you're doing commercial stuff. Maybe you're doing media stuff, and you want to do video games. That's okay. You can do both. There's a lot of crossover. And like when we started, that was all we could get was, we'll do a project for the U.S. Army. It was a small project, and eventually it became this world-renowned project. So you don't know what's going to happen. Anyway, so that's one thing. Is speaking English is a really big deal when you're dealing with English studios. People in China struggle with that. People in other parts of the country struggle with that. Also, the time difference is much closer. When we work with Hyderabad, India, we'd start talking to them at 9 p.m. at night. They were getting up and showing. So after we had worked 12-hour days and we're exhausted and it's 9 or 10 o'clock at night, it's like, oh, let's get on the horn with the guys in Hyderabad and tell them what they need to do. And then we would go to sleep. We'd wake up and hope they did what we told them to do. And being able to work in real time collaboratively with somebody is really, really important. I think another thing we've talked about is that there's a cultural similarity throughout North America, with Latin America, and with a lot of the ideas and the things that we love in terms of just kind of having the perspective. When you go to the Ukraine and you try to explain baseball, exactly, they have no idea what you're talking about.
Do you want to give an example? So if I said classic baseball, raise your hand if you think you understand or have a good idea of what classic baseball is.
Yeah.
Okay. Does one person want to maybe tell us what you think or your idea of classic baseball is? Doesn't matter who. Brave volunteer.
Someone brave.
Yes. No, it doesn't. There's no wrong answer. Please, just anyone. If you raise your hand and you want to explain your feeling about classic baseball, please. Don't be shy. It's okay.
Thank you. Some brave soul. Some brave
just
soul.
Anyone brave. Anyone that wants to do it. That's it. There's no wrong answer at all.
There you go.
Yeah.
So it's pretty much like grabbing a bat, hitting a ball, and running around bases.
Okay.
Is that it?
No, that's fine. That's fine.
Okay.
I worked on a project where the team in Asia didn't understand that. No one had ever played baseball before. They've only seen pictures. They were looking at footage from games, ESPN, and they still could not figure out what that meant. They didn't know where to put the baseball diamonds. They didn't understand where the pitcher's mound was. They didn't understand what the relationship was between the infield, the outfield. And then they had the project and they had to learn that while they were doing that. So that's an example of culturally, it's North and South America, very, very similar cultures. And if there's something that you don't know about, it's very easy to find and ask someone or learn about it and pick it up very quickly. And that flow goes both ways, right? However, you start to move to a culture that's very different from Western culture, even in Eastern Europe. It takes a much longer time to work with that team to help them understand the goals that are set for the project. So
yeah, I would add two things to that. I think from the art side, there's also the creative aspect. We've been looking around. This part of the country is very creative and visual and beautiful, and there's a deep history of art, and something we'd like to explore more. But there are places you go where people are all about, I just want to get paid, I want a paycheck. They're not creative. So cherish that, because video games are intrinsically visual. People are visually motivated. And if you're not somebody who understands that, I'm also speaking to the engineers. Learn what you can about the visual side of things. My parents were both artists. So when I was a graphics programmer, I could speak with the art team. And part of why Chris and I get along is that you could go tell a bunch of engineers like, oh, I needed cooler colors, and they're like, what's that? And so being able to speak the language of being visual and creative is a big part of it. The other side to it, on the engineering side, being able to read and speak English is really important, because a lot of the documentation is just written in English. And that's a huge, huge deal for coming up to speed quickly. So being able to read technical documentation and write that, and this goes back to constantly learning, because the APIs are changing, the technology base is changing. So that's really an important detail. But so anyway, that's.
In many cases, there are other companies out there, other external development studios that have huge departments dedicated to translating documents into Cyrillic, into Bulgarian, into Mandarin, into Cantonese, and they don't oftentimes get it right. There are many things that they miss, and it's not that they're doing a bad job. It's just that culturally, it's harder to understand certain things that you've never seen before. I've got a million stories. I don't want to bore you with them, but there are many examples, and I've learned that being on both sides of the fence, being the person who was asking for a particular thing, explaining a style or something like that, or being on the opposite side of that, where the client is asking for that same thing and working with the team to help them understand exactly what is being asked for, so they can go, okay, I get it. But even then, they're only getting that one aspect the entire pool of what's surrounding that bit of information is so much more vast, but it's just getting little pieces and then hoping and helping the team to coalesce that into one cohesive understanding of classic baseball.
And the other thing is that the video game industry in Mexico is going to grow as you guys grow it. Small teams, indie teams, doing your own passion projects, the game jams that you get to do, you're lucky. We didn't get to do those. I would have killed for that, to have a group of people. And people do that spontaneously now. But, again, we started at a company that was mostly doing, contract work and outsource. And I will mention, there's a trap. You want to be really careful of not becoming what we call a port house. So as you come through and this is more of like a high level strategy. I don't know if there's business people or producers or aspiring producers in the group, but as you're doing projects for contract, you have to make sure you're picking good projects and you get whatever work you can. And that's what we've done. But you also have to keep the fire alive. You have to have something that you're working on as well, and not get caught in the trap of only being able to do ports. And that balance, there's no secret to that. You just have to work really hard, and you have to just believe in yourself. And nobody knows where the next great game idea is going to come from. It could be somebody sitting in this room. We worked on some great games that when we started, they didn't seem like great games.
One other thing that's something that we'd like to share, and I know, John, you'll agree with this, is always bring something to the table. Go above and beyond what you're being asked to do, whether that's with your assignment, whether that's with your contract job, whether it's with your first company, whatever the case may be. But as a studio, if you're able to bring something to a partner, a client, or whatnot, that they ask for this, and you've taken that and said, hey, you know what? We experimented with this. Here's what you asked for. But we tried this with your same tools. What do you think? If you can show that you're thinking, that you're not just going to say, okay, we went from point A to point B to point C and on, and that's it. Assignment done, check mark, move. Sometimes you're going to have a project like that where there isn't a lot of wiggle room. But if you can always offer that new solution, a different take, a different twist, something else, that is golden, because that's what people who are in studios are looking for, right? They're usually inventing the process, the idea, the IP. But if you can prove that you can be creative, and that you can be creative within constraints, that company, that group, that team will always come back to you. Yep. Guaranteed. Yep. Every time.
And people will notice. Mm-hmm. Chris and I, we were in the trenches. We were where you sit right now. We work in 80-hour weeks or 100-hour weeks and banging away there till 2 a.m, trying to make some texture look good or get one little bug in a UI fix. And look to the person on your right, look to the person on your left. This is a small industry. The people in here, if you stay in this industry, some of the guys that we worked with at Pandemic, who was like, oh, hey, what's up, Brian? He's now the executive producer of all development at Universal Studios. One of the guys is the creative director of Halo. That's going to be you eventually. So always bring your best to the game, because the people are going to remember what you did now, 2 years from now, 4 years from now, 10 years from now, and they'll come back to you when they saw that you went that extra mile. And that goes back to the original point. Always ship. Always get it done, because people will remember that. And maybe this project right now that you're working on for a year or a year and a half, it'll close and you'll do another one. And then someone will call you and go, I remember that thing you did, and we need that. And they will pull you in. And that's, I think, it's a small industry. So,
did anyone else have any other questions?
You got a question? Sorry. Nope. Any other questions?
Please.
You as an art director, what do you think about procedural art? And do you think it's going to reach the level in which it's going to substitute artists?
Nope.
Thank you.
I'm sure you're referring to, let's say, that new tool by the Stadia group at Google.
All the tools are
Can you repeat the question?
Okay, let me repeat the question. Please tell me if I asked it correctly. Do you think that, or do we feel that that there will be some tool or something else that will replace artists in art direction? No. Here's the thing, and I'll tell you this about, let's say there's a new tool being that was just announced by Google with the Stadia group, a new group that they've had up in San Francisco. That can put any art style into any game. They can basically paint the environment, worlds, streets, moons, whatever the case is, with whatever style that exists. And that frightens a lot of people, sure, because you're thinking, well, what am I supposed to do if you're doing that? Now, I can say this, looking at that, there's no craft there. That's a procedurally generated something to say, I'm taking this image and I'm stretching it over these pixels and getting this result, and here's an average of how it's going to look right and not stretch and stuff like that. That's a computer program running that. A computer will never be able to invent a style because all the parameters that you need and how you see things are never going to be able to be simulated. And if it is something that's in a simulation, we won't be here anyway. It'll all be computers that are doing it. And that won't be for 1,000 years. So,
yeah, I would go one further and say that there are tools that have been invented for the last 20 years and more. And we're really glad to have them because there's a whole lot of things that, like, do you want to generate normal maps by hand? Right. We used to do that. Yeah. Do you want to generate ambient occlusion? Right. We used to paint that. Now you press a button. That's not something you want to be doing, and the end result is much better. So it frees you to do the more creative part of the job. But you have to be excellent. Yep. And you have to be technical as an artist. That's really important.
Right. And don't be threatened by any of those tools. You figure out how you can use those tools to help you do a better job. Let's say that one program that I mentioned to you, sure, it would take a long time to apply a particular style that's never been applied to a game before to it. However, what else can you create from there that you would have never been able to do if you didn't have that piece of software that allowed you to push the boundaries of something and move it forward a little bit to invent a new style, right? And even then, all those styles have to come from someplace. If you take the work of Cezanne and put it in a video game, if there was no Cezanne, it doesn't matter what the software would do, right? So you're always going to be in a position because the circumstances will always change. You'll have happy accidents when you're inventing or developing a style. You'll have tools that will be able to push you into a genre that you're going, wow, I never thought I could do this before, and you're able to push it forward. Let's say Sunset Overdrive, something like that. That was a completely new thing that you've never been able to create unless you had one style here, and then someone had the tools to be able to apply that into a 3D space.
Yeah, I want to talk about a historical precedent for this. We all like to think that we're special snowflakes and this has never happened before in history. I don't know how many of you know the history of theater in Europe, but the history of theater was, you had Shakespeare and you had the great plays and the Italian operas, and it began to get bigger. And it got bigger and bigger and bigger to the point where, much like video games, you start out with something small in concept and a few people on, a wooden box speaking and performing and puppet shows. And it entertained people. It brought joy to people. And that's really what video games are about. But in theater, it kept getting bigger. It got bigger and bigger to the point where if you wanted to go see a show in Europe at a certain period of time, there had to be elephants on the stage. And the stage was 100 yards deep. And they had actual model ships in actual water. And you had these massive, expensive productions that had to happen. Or otherwise, it wasn't better than the thing that had come before it. And so there was a long period of time where things had to get bigger and better and more exciting. And you can go back and study the history of theater. And then once it got to a certain point where it was so realistic, you're like, I'm watching the actual Battle of Athens and people are, there's chariots and elephants, and then it all stopped. And when you go see theater now, it could just be a guy with a chair and a turtleneck. Hey, it's all imagination. Or it could be 3 people in a room. There's still the big productions. You still go out and you see big productions in theater. But it's not all of theater, and you don't have to do that anymore. And the exact same thing has happened in video games, where you got bigger and bigger, and Grand Theft Auto, and every year, and it's more and more realistic and photoreal, and now we have facial expressions, and now we have translucent skin, and now we have, the nose hairs have to point a certain way, whatever needs to get real and real. And then indie games happen. This has already happened in video games. Right. You've now got these cool little creative things. So when you ask about, well, where's the artist going to go if all these things are generated? It's like the answer is creative, the joy, the passion. And now you guys are lucky because you don't have to do these massive projects. They're still there and they pay really well, so it's not a bad place to learn the craft. But you can also do smaller projects and they can be successful, and you can have both. So I think the historical precedent here is worth understanding that this has already happened in video games, and theater didn't go away. There's still tons of wonderful theater. So
I have one more thing to add to that, and this is I like ancient stuff, so I have to. When you mentioned this is perfect. There was an inventor, and he was an inventor in the Library of Alexandria. His name was Huron. Okay, and he was the first person we know of in history who had a lot of automation. He invented the steam engine, the first ones. He invented robotics. He invented a lot of automated things. And one of the things that he invented automated systems for were theaters. So he had an entirely elaborate system where you could have a theater show with no actors. You'd have dolphins, you'd have audio, you'd have all kinds of different things playing, and it was perfectly timed with all the knots and gears and things like that, all the technology at the time, to make sure that this play went on for 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes. And it was almost like an amusement park. You would have a certain amount of time that you would sit and you would watch. Someone would come out and say something or whatnot. They had music, they had things that would simulate weather, all that type of stuff. And then the group would get up and they'd move on either to another show or to another aspect. And guess what people said at the time? You're putting actors out of business. Did it happen? No, because the Roman Empire fell. So, of course, there were still actors, but there was no infrastructure to have this elaborate system of a show, of a theater. So it's these things come around. You never know what is going to happen to pull something away, and then it will allow something else to move into its place. Or as John mentioned, it expands. Who would ever think that you have your AAA console games for God of War and Call of Duty and all these other huge franchises, and guess what sells more than those right now? Anyone guess? Pokemon Go.
My kids love it.
$20 billion or something like that.
I love it.
Yeah, it's fantastic, but it's nothing like any of those giant AAA franchises. And it's on this device, not a console, not in your home, doesn't have a 20-year background. It's on your phone. No one would have thought of that 20 years ago. Phones were the size of consoles at that point.
It's true. Any other questions?
No question's a bad question or a dumb question. Please, anything.
Yeah, hi. From your perspective of view, what is the direction of the industry of video games? Yeah, where it's going?
So the question restated is, what is the direction of video games? I think maybe you can comment on this a little more, but Chris said it's expanding, and I think that's true. There's augmented reality, there's virtual reality, and there's HoloLens, there's still console. You want to know the one thing in video games that every 4 years, since I can remember, people would said, it's dead? PC. Every 4 years, someone's like, the new Xbox is more powerful than a PC. Who's going to do PC games? And then World of Warcraft comes out.
Right.
Or Fortnite. Or, of course, now Fortnite's on mobile, but so there's PC is still just chipping away ever since the days of Doom and Ultima. It's still one of the best platforms you can develop for. And then you've got mobile and you've got whatever the next thing is that we don't know what it is. So it's going in many different directions. And I would also add that people are doing gamification of things that they didn't think to gamify.
Healthcare applications.
Healthcare, fitness. There's a lot of this stuff that's being studied. Also, like treatments. I was talking to somebody the other day about treatments for autistic kids, and I have a friend of mine who is developing a video game for kids who have problems with self-control, like medical problems with self-control. And so there's a video game that, and what was interesting about the game, I'll just talk about it briefly, was they take a game that you like to play, and then they track your galvanic skin response, which is a way of saying, are you upset? And as you get upset and emotional, instead of making the game easier, they just make it way harder. Like stuff goes over the screen and it forces the kid who's doing something they love to learn to control themselves and calm down. And they've proven that this is more effective than all the medications. And so my buddies, this is with Harvard out in Boston, they're putting this out to kids who don't have another means. So that's a game, but it's blessing people and helping them. So it's expanding. Sorry, I said you.
No, it's fine. There was another angle to that is right now, and this is happening currently, and you can see the news where it's going on. The brands that you're going to see in the future are not going to come from the traditional places. They're going to come from video games. Riot Games just announced a television show based on League of Legends. You've had Blizzard make movies. You have the Tomb Raider series, and sure, Hollywood has been the main, I'd say the main focal point for how those brands come into fruition. But that's no longer happening. The companies are able to push the brand out themselves with books, with comics, with live action, with video games, with their video game tournaments. You don't even need Hollywood anymore for that. Those video game tournaments are huge. I have one of my friends, her husband, he's thinking about starting a company that specializes in creating events for games, for Fortnite, for League of Legends, for
Overwatch,
for all kinds of different games. So all that is happening outside of the traditional means. So those brands, those future brands, are going to be based on games because they're ubiquitous now. Everyone knows them. They're using them. So people are saying, hey, how do we expand into other territories in addition to an interactive product?
Yeah, and it all comes back to art. All the engineers, don't close your ears on this. What is art? It's a dangerous question.
Raise your hand.
I'll give you a definition that was given to me, which is art. Art is anything that creates emotion in the observer. You can have a video game that's technically correct, and people will say, it's not fun. Why? I don't know. They can't tell you. Most people can't tell you why a game is not fun, and it's because it doesn't create emotion. Sometimes that emotion is fear. That's why people watch horror movies. I actually think, this is my advice, if you're doing an indie game, the best genre to start in is horror. Here's why. It can be silly and campy and also scary because people like being scared when they know they're safe.
I have one thing to add to that. It's also cheaper.
It's cheaper
because everything is dark,
silly
and you can use sound, and you can use very few assets, right. And you're using that emotion and that psychological response that people have to darkness. You can use that,
and that's also where a lot of film directors got their start. Sam Raimi and Peter Jackson. Peter Jackson did a little movie called Lord of the Rings. He started as a horror guy, and so that is for a reason. It's an easy emotion, but there's other emotions: regret, joy, and passion, love. It's really hard to get love in a video game. There are a few people who have done it, but it's different kinds of love, and that's something people. Oh, you can't have love in a video game. It's damn straight you can, but people still haven't figured that out yet. Mostly people have excitement. You're racing a car or you're trying to beat something. So there's excitement. But if you don't have that emotion, if you're not bringing that joy to somebody, then that's why it's not. That's one reason why it's not fun. That's a whole different topic. We could do a whole lecture on what makes a game fun. But
we should.
But yeah, in terms of expanding, it's about bringing those joy in all those different experiences, whether it's going to a video game competition and participating by watching, or whether it's having it on your phone, or whether it's the virtual reality of Minecraft on your desktop, which you've never had before. So I think there's just endless forms of this.
There was.
Hi.
I'm sorry. There was one more question.
There was one
here. The
here.
gentleman in the green shirt. I didn't mean to.
Sorry, Benno.
If you had a question, I didn't mean to take away. I just didn't want to. I want to make sure you weren't forgotten. Yeah.
Hi. Well, I want to know, how do you measure the deadline for a game development?
That's a great question. How do you measure the deadline for a game development? If you're good, you do it well. But the history of video games is strewn with shipwrecks of games that went over budget, over time. Ironically, some of the greatest successes did that, both in video games and in other industries. Jaws, one of the greatest movies of all time, went double or triple over budget. That's the famous, so then there's always some crazy director who's like, I need more money, I need more time. But for every one of those guys, there's 9 guys who are just blowing through it. How do you measure that it's on deadline?
Here's one thing I'll say about that is be realistic about where you are. There's being optimistic about what you can do, but there's being realistic about how far you can go, right? So, for example, if you have $5 in gas money, you're not driving 1,200 miles. you're going to go as long as whatever money you have in your pocket will take you, right? So there's being optimistic in what you want to do, but you have to really take a hard look at each phase of where you are and be honest about where you are, how far you've come, how far you think you can go. The places that I've found and have seen, and I'm sure Jon can say the same thing, that have not been very successful or have just gone away, have not been realistic about what it is they're doing and where they are. I mean, there are plenty of people who you've seen, they have books on the wall, break all the rules, and, don't listen to anybody else, and all these great things that are great for the person who wrote them, but they're taking the wrong message from that. Sure, there's a time when you don't want to follow the herd, right? And you should do that. You should always ask yourself, are we going the right direction? Are we differentiating ourselves from other products, or are we doing something new and unique? However, if new and unique takes way too much time and effort, you need to scale that back and do what you can do and do something that is feasible, but also people will recognize, and have maybe 10% crazy or wild or out there. But I think that's one thing that really differentiates that, and that's how you're able to manage scope and manage risk.
I think the other thing to add to that is that game development is a team sport. Yeah, there used to be one guy went and made a game, and if you're doing a game jam, good luck to you. Do it by yourself. That's cool. But let's be honest, to get a great result, you need a team. And that team doesn't have to be 300 people. It can be 3 people. But at least from my point of view, I think there's like 5 roles, 3 that are most important: the artists, the engineers, and the game designer. Because if you have great artists and great engineers, you have something that looks great and it runs well, but it's not fun. If you have a great game designer and an awesome artist, it looks great, would be fun to play if it worked. If you have great engineers and a great designer, you have this really cool technical game that runs smooth, but it looks terrible. So you really need to fire on all cylinders, as we say. So everybody has to work together. So when you're developing a game, you need to understand your role in that space. You can try and do everything, but there's also kind of an intrinsic role that people fall into, that they have strengths, and so they're going to be really good in a particular role. And if they try and phase over in the other one, they could do it, but they may not be as good as somebody else who that's their special sauce. And I said there were 5 roles. So there's 2 more. And these other 2 roles are, in my opinion, Chris may disagree, the director and the producer. The director and the producer of a game have this kind of brother-sister relationship where they're fighting with each other in a good way, where the director's like, we're going this way, and we're going all the way up that hill, and everything has to be perfect. And the producer goes, okay, we got $5 in gas, so, pull it back a little bit. And that's a healthy interchange when you have 2 people who are good. And understanding, in terms of the original question, which was how do you stay on target, that is the producer's job. Accountability for all the assets, making sure people can do the things that they need to do. They have the things they need to do, and that things are on time and budget. And I think it's an unsung role. A lot of people don't really appreciate how incredibly important a producer is. Because if you're also an artist and a producer at the same time, it's like you're kind of conflicted. But if you're going around and producing, if you're a lead, realize you only can do half the work that anybody working with you is, because it's your job to solve other people's problems and keep them on target and worry about this particular problem so that they don't have to. And the director, meanwhile, is like, I want more. I'm a director. So there's a maturity. The first thing I did when I started my last company was I hired a producer who would tell me no. And he was amazing. And eventually, towards the end of the project, at the start of the project, I'm like, raw, real rock. And towards the end of the project, I did nothing, and he went around with a bat going, get it done. Because we had different roles and different demeanors, and that worked really, really well. Just so you know, if you ever end up at Electronic Arts, they call these opposite. They call the director, the producer director.
Exactly. So they have a producer, and the producer is the equivalent of a creative director.
Right.
And the development director is the equivalent of a producer. So
doesn't matter what they're called.
Yeah, exactly. When I work there, I'm going, wait a minute, why are you talking about the creative juices about the project and you're the producer? It was very strange. But, oh no, they sat me down and said, oh, this is what the roles are. Now, here's the thing. EA has that. That's just it's the same roles. They just have different names. If you're on a project that has that problem, the producer is acting as the creative director, whatnot, and the director is acting as the producer. That's when you need to sit down, as I mentioned before, Stop. Be honest about what you're doing, where you're going, because if those two roles are reversed, it's going to be very, very hard to move forward because, as John mentioned, an artist and a producer doing the same job, you're conflicted. You've got to pick one. You've got to be an artist or you've got to be a producer. And sometimes you may be an artist because there is no producer. And I've had this with the project we were on. You had to be a producer because we didn't have one. There was no senior producer.
Until
the guy
the end.
quit until the very end.
Angel showed up.
And there was an AP, and she was new to the role, and there was no way she could handle it. And for whatever reason, the company didn't hire anyone else. So all the production teams had to get together. The engineering team, the design team, the art team. We had to get together and say, okay, we're all going to have to do a little bit of production work to not only help our own teams, but to help each other move through this, this phase of pushing this into development and getting it finished. So
I actually have a story about this. It's a short story. It's fun. I worked on a team. This was we were doing an original project, and I worked with a really great producer. He actually did Epic Mickey later. And a bunch of other games. He did a bunch of famous Donkey Kong Country, which is a really old classic famous game. He placed the bananas back in the day. And we had to hire an associate producer. And so he had to do a bunch of interviews. And he pulled me aside and he said, this is how we're going to interview the producers. I asked him one question. I said, you're on a project, and the director comes to you and says, we need red ninjas, and you know that green dragons is better. How do you change his mind? How do you go about changing his mind? How do you get, or not even change his mind, how do you make sure that green dragons gets in the game? Because it's a trick question. It's not your job. So he interviewed associate producers, and he would ask them this question, and they'd say, I'd go around to the rest of the team and I'd convince all of them the Green Dragons was better. So you're out of here, Or he'd be like, I'd argue with the guy in the hall until he saw my way. It's like, you're out of here. He's like, well, what would you do? He's the director. If he wants red ninjas, he's seeing a whole lot of other things that maybe I don't know. My job is to make sure he gets the best red ninja you can get. So that's what a producer does. Producer is not a creative person by role, but they're probably a very creative person if they work in video games. So you just need to watch out for that when you find yourself in that role, sometimes as a lead. So sometimes, anyway, that's the story, and I love that story. Do we have one more, Adela?
Hi. So this comes from Facebook, and it's two of them. The first one is, do you think that a single-player games with story are going down in base users? And the second one is, what do you think makes a franchise big and successful?
Two good questions. Do I think that single-player games with narrative are going down? No. I mean, I think you have to also be able to measure down, making less money, less number of players, less awards. I mean, there's still these wonderful moving single-player games. God of War keeps reinventing itself every year and really finding a depth of emotion that you wouldn't think they could do from a game that's basically about killing monsters, And with this last one with the son and the role and the fatherhood, they're tying in all sorts of stuff. I think some of those are getting bigger, and I think there's lots of opportunity for that. And I think on handheld devices, you can have opportunities for doing that. And we have yet to see the type of narrative single player games that are going to come about with like AR and VR and other stuff. And those will be amazing. Like walking through a space and experiencing a world where you're the center of the story. I would add that, and I said this at the very beginning, games are not about narrative. Games are not about story. Story is incredibly important in games, especially games that are story-driven. And the story is there to pull you through the game, but a lot of times people overemphasize how important story is. But you can't not have it. And we have a lot of friends who are somewhat well-established, famous game writers, and they probably would throw tomatoes at me right now for saying that, because I mean, the work that they do is incredibly important. My uncle is actually a writer by profession. He's a science fiction author, and we've had many stories about, you've got a protagonist, you chase him up a tree and you throw rocks at him. The difference with games is it's got to be about the interactivity. And so I wouldn't say it's going down, but I would say that if you think about your game, and if you have decided in your head and in your heart that it has to be a single-player story-driven game, think about why. Is it the story? Do you want to be a writer for Hollywood? Or do you want to be a game maker? And think about what your game would be if you took the story away completely and see what's left. If there's nothing left, then it's not a game. It's just a story. There are a lot of games that you can take the story out completely. You still have a game. It's not as rich. It doesn't have the same backstory. And you're also going to have two different types of audiences. There are some people who, if you put lore in your game, like little books, they will go around and read every single little story, and they love that. I'm one of those people. I really like lore and narrative. There are some people who are like delete, next, skip. They just want to get to the next part of the game. So what was the second question was?
What do you think makes a franchise big and successful?
Why don't you take this one?
Sure. What do we think makes a franchise big and successful? I'd say part of that is your knowing who your audience is and understanding that from the beginning. Okay. And also the second part is once you understand who the audience is, keep moving, listen to that audience, see how they respond to it. The audience may be a little bit smaller, but you may have a core set of fans. Listen to those fans, listen to those people, listen to what they're telling you. Try to give them what they want, of course, within reason. But I think in a nutshell, that's what makes a successful franchise. That you're able to listen to the core audience, you're taking that feedback, and then on the next phase, if you have the opportunity to do it, you're giving them, more of what they want, and you're not taking it away. And there are always going to be little things that you go, we wish we could have done that. It's not about you. For the original feature set that you had that you want to implement in the next game because you think it would be better, if that is not what your fans are asking for, that's not what they like, throw it out. That's not necessarily going to make it better, and that's also based on assumptions that you had at the very start, and that may negate what you're doing in the future. So listen to your audience, find out what they want, go out and ask them. A lot of people don't do that. They have marketing people and stuff like that. Figuring out all those things as the developer, go out and ask people, what do you like about this? What do you not like about this? Have more personal contact. And many companies are doing that. They're finding ways that they're not going through the normal streams of having all these gates that give you the information that they found out about your fans, because in many cases, as we mentioned with translation, they may not be translating correctly what the fans actually want, right? So it's best for the creators to go out and find out what people want to have, and that's why you have giant franchises, because they're very active about saying that, and if you're receptive to it, they're going to continue doing it.
I would add two things to that, and I can't remember the game right now. But there's this funky niche Flash game. So this is a number of years ago. There's this funky little niche Flash game that had a core group of audience that loved the game, and they found success, ironically, by abandoning that core group. And so what happened is that they had, it was like 2,000 people or 5,000 people. It was really small, but it was a really cool game, and they had some ideas, and they're like, wow, we should change this to be like this. And they did it, and that core group absolutely went bananas, like flame wars. They were like, oh, we hate this. You've taken away from us what we loved about the game. But it turned out like 50 or 100,000 other people really liked the new thing. So you have to kind of understand what is success. Just because somebody likes it, that audience may be very small. I mean, you see this in music, you see this in other art forms where a band may not have the kind of appeal, for instance, to be in big stadiums. They may not be the next U2, but they may also be creating something that's really special that speaks to an audience. So you have to kind of decide what audience is your game speaking to and who are they, and you do need to listen to them. For successful franchises, they absolutely listen. But I think the point is sometimes you have to abandon your audience. I would not recommend that. Most of the time you listen to your audience and you get the feedback. Feedback is a big key thing here. You have to have thick skin in this industry.
Sure.
But there were two things. Big successful franchises, marketing. We're going to crack the door here real quick on the financial side of the video game industry that I know when I was sitting where you are, I had no idea this is how it is. Let's say that you have $100 going into the budget of the game. There's at least $100 going into the marketing. So for these big franchises, like if you got a $200 million USD Halo, there's $250 million of USD going into marketing. So if you're coming out going like, my game's better than Halo, I'm going to beat them. You're not. Well, your game could be better. You could be right, but no one's going to hear about it because they've got $200 million that says otherwise. Tencent is that way. They put an unbelievable amount. The guys at Fortnite are making $130 million a month. So you're not going to outspend those people. All the Facebook games, the whole history of finance of Facebook games, by the way, was entirely about who could spend the most money. It didn't matter whether the games were good at all. This is a whole other study we can go into. So as you're picking what you want to do and you're thinking about, oh gosh, why is Grand Theft Auto so successful? It's like, because they've got a $500 million budget based upon previous success. So don't try and do what they're doing, because you could do every single thing they're doing and not have that marketing budget, and it just won't be as successful. And those games are massive risks.
Absolutely. One thing I want to add to that, and then I have just something I saw recently that I learned about that I wanted to share with you. And one is, in many cases, if you're a small studio, you may not have a giant marketing budget. Or let's say if you're published by someone, they say, well, we're going to put this much into the marketing budget. Don't let that stop you. If you have to take your game to Comic-Con and form a group and have security tell you, hey, you can't show the game here, do it. Do that every single time. Get the word out there. You may not have the money. You may not have the support. Make it. Go out and tell people. The more you tell people, if you have a good product, people will tell other people. People are going to tell their friends. They're going to tell their family. They're going to tell everyone that they come across, so they can help do the marketing for you. So a lot of people call that guerrilla marketing. I think that's just being smart.
Also, good games.
Yeah, make good games. You have a good game, people will know it. They'll love it. They'll play it. It'll get around, and you'll be able to build your core. And next time, hopefully, you'll have a bit more of a budget to do it, because you can't always start out with a giant budget, especially if you're making a small game. One thing I wanted to add from what Jon mentioned about changing the audience. You may have a good core audience, but you may realize if you want a larger audience, you may have to do something that's going to step on the toes of your core audience to expand. And every company, every group has to think about that. And one thing I learned not too long ago was that how Katy Perry started. Everyone knows who Katy Perry is, yes? Good. Do you know how she started? What she was singing? What? I'm sorry? Church, absolutely. She was a religious rock singer. Yeah, Katy Perry, religious rock singer. Great voice, great stage presence. Audience was the size of a town fair when it's raining. Like, there was no one going to see her sing, but she had all the tools. She was fantastic, but she was not singing the right kind of songs, and she was not performing in front of an audience that was really going to recognize her and, again, share that word of mouth. So she did a little change, and now you have the current version of Katy Perry.
Yeah, and I would add to that. I think if you're looking at the giant successful franchises and trying to understand why they're successful, that's probably not a good use of your time. They're very complicated. There's huge budgets. There's huge analysts. There's a lot of stuff going on at the executive level that nobody is going to have information about. I would say focus on the thing you're doing, and don't have fantasy that your game is going to be the next giant franchise. That's not useful. Do what you can do today to make your game and the widget you're working on, the piece of code you're working on, the best possible. Because for you, the people around you are going to see that passion. 5 years from now, 10 years from now, they're going to call you up and say, hey, come back and do this. Or maybe 5 weeks from now, they're like, let's do a game jam, dude. I saw you do that cool particle effect. I've got a whole game just about that particle effect. And you're like, what? And they're like, no, wait till you see it. And then you go and you do something, and you get something that has an emotion, and it hooks with people, and you take it to Comic-Con, and they kick you out. But people hear about the game because it's a good game. This is how this happens. So
what you do now, that great game that you made that maybe not so many people understood, what you learn from there, you're going to apply that in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, maybe even 10, to that giant successful franchise. And somebody will recognize your work and say, hey, I've got this idea. Would you mind helping me out with this? And that could be that one thing, but you have the expertise in order to do that. And part of that is that the people who make those types of games, they are the pros. They are the best in the industry. And they've become the best in the industry because they've just honed their craft. They really know what they're doing. They're learning, they're expanding, they're talking, they're sharing their ideas, they're taking feedback, they're taking the criticism, and they're able to move into a position where someone says, hey, because of the giant machine of some corporations and businesses, they say, hey, we want this person who we know this could be a great idea. We need the best people to do it. And then sometimes you'll do that very early, but oftentimes it takes a while to be able to work on something like that, be a part of it.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Jon.
Thank you so much to share with us your experience and your knowledge. Well, this is the end.
Sorry.
Oh, that one's mine. Yeah.
Bien, bueno, pues muchas gracias a todos por estar aquí, por acompañarnos y pues una vez más un aplauso, ¿no? Para estos señores.